The sound of tires crushing the gravel on the road echoed in the silence of the afternoon. Margaret gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The cold autumn wind passed through the skeletal trees, as if even nature could feel the unrest growing inside her. It had been months since she last heard Sarah's voice. No phone calls, no messages. Just a suffocating silence that haunted her day after day. The large mansion appeared in the distance, imposing and desolate, surrounded by gardens that were once well-tended but now seemed abandoned. Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. With her heart tight, she parked the car in front of the main entrance and got out, feeling the icy wind against her face. Her daughter was inside, but why wasn't she answering? The silence was so loud it seemed to scream. When she rang the heavy doorbell, the sound echoed through the house, empty and distant. Her fingers trembled slightly. It didn't take long for the door to open, revealing Henry, her son-in-law. He looked at her with surprise, but the smile he gave was forced, lacking warmth. "Margaret," he said, his voice too controlled. "We weren't expecting you. Before we start the story, I'd like to know what city you're watching from. Tell me in the comments, and I'll leave a heart for you." The coldness in Henry's eyes made Margaret's heart race even more. She had always felt uneasy around him, a man of few words, always so calculated. But today something was different. There was a tension she couldn't ignore. "I've tried calling Sarah several times, Henry. I haven't seen her in weeks," Margaret said, trying to hide the tremor in her voice. Henry remained impassive. "She's not well. She's resting. Sarah has been weakened in the past few months. I believe stress is affecting her greatly." His voice was so calm that it almost convinced her. "Almost. I need to see her," Margaret said, stepping forward. Henry blocked her path with his body, still wearing that polite smile. "I don't think that's a good idea right now, Margaret. She needs rest. We're doing everything we can to help her." Henry's tone sounded more like an order than an explanation. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest. Every fiber of her being screamed that something was terribly wrong. This wasn't normal. Sarah's silence, Henry's cold gaze, the way he tried to keep her at a distance. Something was going on, something he didn't want her to know. "Henry, please. I'm her mother. I need to see my daughter," she said, now with a firmer voice, pushing past him before he could stop her. Margaret entered the mansion, and a sense of desolation overwhelmed her. The house was colder than she remembered, as if human warmth had been drained from the place. Heavy curtains blocked out the sunlight, leaving the space shrouded in shadows. The air felt thick, suffocating, and the smell of something sweet mingled with the stale perfume of wilted flowers. She climbed the stairs, ignoring Henry's presence behind her. Her heart was racing, anxiety growing in her chest. Finally, she reached Sarah's bedroom door. Without hesitation, she opened the door and stepped inside. The sight of Sarah made her gasp for air. Lying on an enormous bed, surrounded by pillows that seemed to smother her, was her daughter. Margaret could barely recognize the woman lying there. Sarah, once full of life, now looked like a shadow of herself. Her skin was pale, almost gray, her eyes sunken, and her thin arms rested heavily on the blanket. She was there, but she seemed distant, as if trapped somewhere between life and death. "Sarah," Margaret whispered, her voice thick with pain. She rushed to the bed, kneeling beside her daughter and holding her cold hand. "My dear, what happened to you?" Sarah slowly opened her eyes, but her gaze was vacant, lost. She tried to smile, but her lips trembled. The voice that came out was a weak whisper, barely audible. "Mom." Margaret felt her eyes fill with tears. This wasn't the state her daughter should be in. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. Sarah was sick, very sick, and Henry was trying to keep her away. "I'm here, dear. I'm here now," Margaret whispered, stroking her daughter's face gently. The heavy silence was broken by Henry's voice, who had entered the room. "As I said, she needs rest, Margaret. Emotional stress can worsen her condition. She's being cared for. You don't need to worry." Margaret stood up slowly, still holding Sarah's hand, and turned to face Henry. Her eyes, now filled with a determination that had been hidden by fear, locked onto him. "You tell me not to worry, Henry, but my daughter is here, between life and death, and I know something is wrong," Margaret said, her voice trembling with emotion. "What is happening to her?" Henry looked at her for a moment, his eyes cold, and took a step forward. "There's nothing wrong other than the illness Sarah is facing. We're taking care of it." But Margaret knew. The pain in her chest was more than a mother's concern. It was a devastating premonition, a terrifying certainty that her daughter was in danger, and that danger was closer than she imagined. Night had fallen, but the darkness inside Sarah's mansion felt even more oppressive than the shroud of the sky. Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was lurking in every shadow of the house. The weight of the atmosphere suffocated her as she stayed by her daughter's bedside, holding her cold hand. Sarah's eyes, normally so full of life, were dull, as if her vital energy was slipping away with each passing second. Margaret watched her daughter's pale face, almost unrecognizable, and an indescribable pain tightened her chest. "Sarah dear, what's happening to you?" Margaret murmured, tears threatening to fall as she stroked her daughter's hair, feeling the fragility of the strands between her fingers. Sarah tried to speak, her lips moving almost imperceptibly, but no words came out. The effort Sarah made to communicate was painful to watch. Margaret felt powerless, swallowed by overwhelming anguish. How could a mother bear watching her daughter waste away like this, so defenseless? Suddenly, a chill ran down Margaret's spine. She sensed that someone was watching them. She turned and saw Jessica, the housekeeper, standing in the doorway, holding a tray in her hands. Her face was expressionless, but her eyes watched with a chilling coldness. "I brought Mrs. Sarah's tea," Jessica said, her voice low and firm. Margaret watched as Jessica placed the tray on the bedside table next to the bed, but something about the way she moved her hands made Margaret's heart race. A small vial rested beside the teacup, and when Jessica left the room, Margaret felt the air around her grow thin. Margaret's mind swirled with a terrible thought, but she couldn't articulate it just yet. When the housekeeper disappeared down the hallway, Margaret grabbed the vial and examined it. Medicines. There were so many. How many more would Sarah take? How many more did she need before whatever it was finally consumed her entirely? Sarah's eyes opened briefly, and Margaret, desperate, leaned in to hear her. Sarah's voice was a whisper, so weak that Margaret had to strain to hear it. "Mom, please help me." Those 3 words shattered what was left of Margaret's resistance. The desperation in her daughter's voice was the confirmation of her worst fears. Something was wrong. Something was being done to Sarah. Her daughter's plea was like a silent scream, a cry for help that Margaret couldn't ignore. She stood up suddenly, her body trembling with rage and fear. She looked towards the door where Jessica had exited. She needed answers. She needed to understand what was happening in that house that had turned into a tomb of secrets. Margaret took a deep breath, wiping away the tears that had begun to roll down her face. Her pounding heart echoed in her ears, and she felt she could no longer trust anyone in that house except for the unconditional love she had for Sarah. Leaving the room, Margaret found Henry in the hallway, leaning against the wall as if he had been waiting for her. "I told you Sarah needs to rest," he said, his voice deep but with a slightly amused tone, as if he were in control of the situation. "You're making her nervous, Margaret. She needs peace." "Peace?" Margaret exploded, the anger in her voice surprising even herself. "My daughter is dying. Henry, do you think I'm just going to accept your words and pretend everything is fine? I see what's happening here, and I won't leave until I understand everything." Henry stepped forward, a cold smile on his lips. "Margaret, I understand you're worried, but you really have no idea what's happening, do you? Sarah is sick, very sick, and we're taking care of her in the best way possible." His voice was firm, but there was something off in his tone, something Margaret recognized as more of a control tactic than reassurance. She stared at him, fighting the growing panic that threatened to consume her. There was a darkness in Henry's eyes she had never noticed before. Something terrible, something he was trying to hide. And the medicines? Margaret asked, raising the vial towards him, challenging him to explain. What exactly are you giving her? Henry averted his gaze for a brief second, enough for Margaret to know he was lying. That's none of your business, Margaret. The doctors prescribed them. You don't understand the gravity of the situation, he replied, his voice lower and more threatening now. No, Henry. I'm not leaving. I'm not leaving my daughter in your care. I want the truth. Margaret felt her determination grow, as if an invisible flame had been lit inside her. Henry stepped forward, the tension between them rising. His smile was now gone, and his expression hardened. I suggest you be careful, Margaret, he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. She didn't respond. She couldn't. Her throat was dry with fear, but her heart was beating with a new clarity. She knew, without a doubt, that Henry was hiding something that was killing her daughter. Margaret returned to the room, closing the door behind her and locking it. She sat down next to Sarah again, staring at the vial of medicine on the bedside table. Her mother's heart wasn't wrong. There was something terribly wrong in that house, and she wouldn't rest until she discovered the truth. As she stroked Sarah's face, she promised herself she would find a way to save her, no matter what it took, no matter how deep the pit Henry and Jessica tried to dig. I will save you, my daughter, Margaret murmured softly, feeling that the battle was just beginning. Dawn brought little light to the mansion, but Margaret felt as if she had lived through a lifetime of darkness since she arrived. The air inside the house felt heavier with each passing minute, weighed down by unspoken secrets and gazes full of hidden intentions. With every moment she spent by Sarah's side, the despair in her heart grew. The daughter who had once been vibrant and full of energy was now on the verge of collapse. It was as if Sarah's vitality was being drained away slowly, and Margaret felt it like an open wound in her soul. She spent the morning by Sarah's side, watching her daughter's fragile breathing, feeling an overwhelming sense of helplessness. Something was deeply wrong, something Henry and Jessica were trying to hide. Margaret knew they weren't just caring for Sarah as they claimed. And the more time she spent there, the more certain she became that the poison keeping her daughter tied to that bed wasn't just physical. The control they exerted over Sarah was something dark and silent. Around noon, Margaret decided to step out of the room for a moment. She needed a breath, some space to think and process everything that was happening. As she descended the stairs, her steps were slow and cautious, as if she feared the very house could hear her thoughts. She knew Henry was somewhere nearby, and the feeling of being watched followed her constantly. However, when she reached the garden, it was Charles, the gardener, who surprised her. He was standing there, tending to the wilted flowers, but something in his gaze made her stop. Charles was a quiet man, always present, but almost invisible to the family. Now, though, there was something in his eyes that suggested he knew more than he let on. Mrs. Margaret, he said hesitantly. His voice was low, almost a whisper, blending with the sound of the wind. You're worried about your daughter's condition, aren't you? For a moment, Margaret hesitated. What did he know? And why was he so reluctant to speak? But her desperation for answers outweighed any reservations she might have had. She stepped forward, looking directly at Charles. Charles, tell me what you know. I know something is happening. Sarah isn't sick. Not like this. Something is being done to her, and I need to find out what it is before it's too late. Charles's face hardened. He looked around, as if afraid someone might be listening, and then he gave a slight nod. I don't know everything, ma'am, but I've seen and heard things that concern me. Henry, he's not the man you think he is. I've heard him talking to Jessica a few times. I can't say for sure what they're plotting, but I can guarantee it's not for Sarah's benefit. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. More and more, her suspicions were being confirmed. Henry and Jessica were conspiring, and Sarah was the target. But Charles knew more. She could see it in his eyes, the hesitation mixed with fear. Charles, please, Margaret said, her voice faltering but determined. You're the only person here I can trust. If you know something, I beg you tell me. What are they doing to my daughter?" Charles took a deep breath, as if he were carrying a burden he no longer wanted to bear. He looked around once more before approaching Margaret, lowering his voice even further. "They're poisoning Sarah, ma'am. Slowly, day by day. I don't know the exact details, but I heard Henry say that if she looked sick enough, everyone would believe it. He wants her inheritance. And Jessica, well, she's involved in this. I'm not sure why, but she's clearly siding with Henry. They're keeping her sedated, weak, so no one questions her condition." Margaret brought her hands to her mouth, stifling a scream of horror. What he was saying was as terrible as the darkest nightmare. Her daughter was being poisoned, not by an illness, but by the people she should have trusted. And the reason: money. Henry's greed ran deeper than Margaret could have imagined. "I need to do something. I need to get my daughter out of here, Charles, before it's too late," Margaret said, her voice breaking with tears that now flowed uncontrollably. Charles nodded, his expression grave. "We have to be careful. If Henry or Jessica suspects anything, they could act even faster. I'll help you, ma'am, but we need a plan, something that will catch them off guard." Still in shock, Margaret nodded. She couldn't waste time. Her mind was already racing with ideas on how to save Sarah, but now there was more fear than ever. Every second in that house was a threat. If Henry suspected, he could increase the doses. They were dealing with ruthless people, and any mistake could cost Sarah her life. Margaret returned to Sarah's room, her heart pounding wildly, her mind consumed by urgency. Looking at her daughter, so fragile and defenseless, Margaret knew she would do anything to save her. No matter what it took, she would fight with all her strength. As she stroked Sarah's forehead, Margaret felt the intensity of her mission weigh on her shoulders. Now, she knew. Now, everything was clear. "I promise, Sarah," she whispered. "I'm going to get you out of here. I'll save you no matter what it takes." The fight for her daughter was only beginning, and Margaret knew there was no more room for doubt or fear. There was only one path forward: the truth and Sarah's salvation. Night came quickly, bringing with it a cold that seemed to invade Margaret's very soul. As she looked out the window of Sarah's room, where darkness had taken over the garden, fear and despair mingled with a fierce determination. She knew she could no longer delay the inevitable. Charles's discovery had confirmed her worst fears. Her daughter was being poisoned, slowly, in a cruel and calculated way. Looking at Sarah, lying in bed with a face as pale as the moonlight that illuminated the room, Margaret felt her heart tighten. Sarah's eyes were closed, and her breathing was almost imperceptible. She seemed to be slipping away, little by little, and the pain of that was unbearable. With every beat of her own heart, Margaret felt the weight of time. If she didn't act soon, Sarah might never wake up. "Mom," Sarah's weak voice interrupted Margaret's thoughts, making her rush to her daughter's side. Sarah had opened her eyes, just a sliver, and seemed to be trying to fight against the extreme weakness that gripped her. Margaret took her hand and felt the cold touch of her skin, as if Sarah's body was already beginning to shut down. "I'm here, my dear. Stay calm. I'm taking care of you," Margaret whispered, as tears streamed down her face. With great effort, Sarah gently squeezed her mother's hand, and then her lips moved again, forming words that came out as an almost imperceptible whisper. "Something is wrong, Mom. Help me." Those words, so fragile and painful, were the final push Margaret needed. She knew her daughter sensed the danger, even though she was wrapped in her own weakness. The promise to save her, made silently since Margaret had arrived, now needed to be fulfilled. With a kiss on Sarah's forehead, Margaret left the room, determined. Every step she took through the mansion's corridors felt heavier, as if the house was trying to hold her back. The air around her was thick with something dark, as if even the walls were keeping secrets. And Margaret knew where to look. She descended the stairs toward the kitchen, where Jessica spent most of her time. Her goal was clear: find proof, discover the poison, and make sure no one could stop her from saving her daughter. When she reached the kitchen, It was empty, but the silence of the place sent a chill down her spine. It was as if that space, once bustling, now held a deadly secret. With light and careful steps, Margaret began to open the cabinets, rummaging through the shelves in search of something that confirmed her suspicions. Her fingers trembled slightly, but determination kept her from stopping. Finally, after unlocking a cabinet, she found a box with small vials. A clear liquid glistened under the dim light of the kitchen. Margaret grabbed one of the vials and held it tightly, feeling the blood boil in her veins. The label, written in tiny letters, indicated it was a highly toxic substance. The poison. This was the proof she needed. Henry and Jessica were poisoning her daughter, slowly and carefully, so that her death would seem natural and they could inherit her fortune. With the vial in hand, Margaret quickly turned, but her heart nearly stopped when she saw Jessica standing at the entrance to the kitchen, her eyes fixed on her. "I knew you wouldn't stay out of this for long, Margaret," Jessica said, her voice low but dripping with venom. She crossed her arms, her gaze unflinching, as if she had been waiting for this moment. "Now you know, don't you?" Margaret swallowed hard but stood firm. She couldn't show fear. Jessica looked like a shadow in that kitchen, wrapped in an aura of malice that made her seem more dangerous than ever. "Why are you doing this?" Margaret asked, her voice wavering but full of indignation. "Sarah did nothing to deserve this. You have no right to play with her life." Jessica gave a small smile, as if she were standing in front of a naive child. "This isn't personal, Margaret. Sarah just has something Henry and I need. She's just an obstacle, nothing more." Jessica's indifferent tone hit Margaret like a punch in the chest. "And you should stay out of it. This doesn't concern you." Margaret felt the anger boil inside her, a fury she could barely control. She stepped forward, facing Jessica. "Sarah is my daughter, and I won't let her die at your hands," Margaret said, her voice filled with a determination even Jessica hadn't expected. Jessica narrowed her eyes, clearly bothered by Margaret's reaction. But before she could respond, quick footsteps echoed through the hallway. Henry appeared in the kitchen, his face lit by surprise and displeasure at the scene unfolding. "What's going on here?" Henry asked, his voice sharp. Margaret raised the vial with the poisonous substance, glaring at him. "I know what you're doing, Henry. I know you and Jessica are slowly killing my daughter, and I won't let it continue." For a brief moment, Henry was paralyzed, his face assuming an unreadable expression. Then, he let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Margaret, you have no idea how the world works, do you?" he said, taking a step towards her. "This is all for the good of everyone. Sarah doesn't need to suffer anymore. Her fortune will be used for something much greater. For you, Henry? For your ego? For your greed?" Margaret interrupted him, her voice rising with anger. "I won't let you destroy my daughter." Henry gave a cold smile. "You have no choice, Margaret. You're alone in this." However, before Henry could advance, the back door opened, and Charles entered quickly, holding a small recorder in his hand. "I think you're not as alone as you thought, Henry," Charles said, raising the recorder. "Everything's recorded. Every word. Every confession." Henry's expression changed instantly. The smile vanished, replaced by a look of restrained fury. Jessica, on the other side, began to back away, but the panic was already written on her face. Margaret felt her heart race. The moment of truth had arrived. Now, everything was about to collapse for Henry and Jessica. Margaret's heart pounded as the truth finally unfolded before her eyes. The words Henry and Jessica had spoken echoed in her mind like daggers piercing her soul. Sarah was being slowly poisoned, all because of an inhumane ambition, an insatiable greed. But now, with Charles by her side and the proof in her hands, she had a chance to save her daughter. "It's over, Henry," Charles said, holding the recorder. His voice was firm, but his gaze was tired, like someone who had seen much more than he wanted to. "We have everything we need. The authorities will know what you've done." Henry, however, didn't seem intimidated. His gaze was cold, and a bitter smile crossed his face. He stepped forward, staring at Margaret with an intensity that made the air around her feel heavier. "Do you really think this ends here, Margaret?" Henry said, his voice a dangerous whisper. "You don't understand. Sarah was always an obstacle. Always weak, always sensitive. She doesn't have what it takes to survive in this world. But you keep fighting for her, as if it's not too late." His words hit Margaret like a punch. The pain and suffering of seeing her daughter in that state transformed into a quiet fury. She wasn't going to let him keep manipulating her emotions. She was no longer the woman weakened by fear. Now, something stronger was burning inside her. The relentless will to save Sarah. "You're wrong, Henry. Sarah is much stronger than you'll ever know. And so am I." Margaret stepped forward, her voice filled with a firmness that surprised even herself. "And no matter what you do or say, I'm going to get her out of here. I'm going to protect her." Jessica, who had remained silent until then, finally stepped forward, her anger clear in her eyes. She looked from Henry to Margaret, as if trying to decide what to do. "You can't beat them, Margaret. No one's going to believe you," Jessica said, her voice cold, but with a hint of desperation. "Henry has connections. He can turn this around, make you the one at fault. How do you think this is going to end?" Margaret shook her head, feeling the anger bubble inside her. "It's over, Jessica. I have the recorder. I have the proof. Justice will prevail." Charles placed a firm hand on Margaret's shoulder, as if to remind her she wasn't alone anymore. That simple gesture gave her strength, and for the first time in months, Margaret felt there was light at the end of the tunnel. "Let's get out of here," Charles said, his voice low but determined. "I'll get Sarah. We have little time before the police arrive." Margaret nodded. The fear was still there, but something new had settled in her heart. Hope. They had to act quickly. Every passing minute was another risk of Henry making a final move. Margaret knew he wouldn't give up easily. Charles quickly went upstairs to get Sarah, while Margaret kept her eyes on Henry and Jessica, sensing the looming danger. The two exchanged glances, as if calculating their next steps. "If I were you, Margaret, I'd leave right now. Before things get out of your control," Henry said, his voice lower, with an almost threatening tone. "You're wrong, Henry. I'm no longer afraid of you." Margaret's words came out with a strength she didn't even know she had. "My daughter is going to survive, and you're going to pay for everything you've done." Henry's gaze turned into pure hatred. He stepped forward again, the tension in the air rising, but was interrupted by the sound of the upstairs door opening. Charles had returned, carrying Sarah in his arms, her face pale and her breathing weak. Margaret rushed over to them, holding her daughter's hand with a desperate grip. Sarah was so fragile, but her eyes opened briefly when she sensed her mother's presence. The relief of seeing Sarah still conscious, still alive, brought tears to Margaret's eyes. "It's going to be okay, my dear," Margaret whispered, her voice broken by sobs. "I'm here now. We're getting you out of here." Jessica took a few steps back, watching the scene with a growing expression of frustration. It was as if her advantage was crumbling, and the fury was about to take over. "You're going to regret this, Margaret," Jessica murmured, her voice dripping with venom. "No," Margaret replied, not even looking at her. "The one who's going to regret it is you." With Sarah in Charles's arms, they began walking towards the door, feeling the weight of the moment dissolve with every step. Margaret looked back one last time, seeing Henry and Jessica standing still, their faces filled with hatred and defeat. "We called the police. They're on their way," Charles said as they left the mansion. "It's over." The cold night air enveloped Margaret as they stepped through the front door. But for the first time since she arrived, she felt that the chilly breeze was a promise of freedom, not despair. Every breath was a relief. Every step further from the mansion a reminder that the battle was almost over. Sarah was safe. But Margaret knew the road to recovery would be long and painful. They got into Charles's car, and as the darkness of the road stretched ahead, Margaret looked at her daughter's sleeping face, her skin still pale but alive. Alive. That was the only word that mattered now. The lights of the ambulance and police appeared in the distance, and Margaret finally allowed her body to relax. The nightmare was coming to an end, but the love and pain she carried for Sarah would keep her strong for what lay ahead. She held her daughter's hand again and closed her eyes for a moment. "We're safe now, Sarah. Everything's going to be okay." The sound of sirens cut through the air as the police and ambulance quickly approached the mansion. Margaret watched the scene, her heart still pounding, but now filled with a mix of relief and exhaustion. Every flash of the blue and red lights reflecting on Sarah's sleeping face, cradled in Charles's arms, was a painful reminder of the gravity of the situation. Sarah was still so weak, so fragile, but alive. That was the only thing keeping Margaret standing at that moment. When the police entered the mansion, Henry and Jessica were still standing at the entrance, like statues. Henry's face, once so controlled and calculated, now showed a desperate coldness. He knew the game was over. The police moved quickly, handcuffing Henry while he kept his eyes fixed on Margaret, a final attempt to intimidate her, to control what he had already lost. "This doesn't end here, Margaret," he hissed as he was led away. "You don't know who you're dealing with. I'll get out of this, and you'll never have peace." Margaret looked at him, unfazed. For the first time, Henry no longer scared her. She had faced the worst he could do, and she had won. Her daughter was alive. She didn't need anything else. "It's over, Henry. It's over for you," she replied, her voice firm but filled with deep sadness. Jessica, on the other hand, didn't resist. She was taken away silently, her face immobile like a mask without expression. Behind that calm, Margaret knew frustration and desperation were boiling. Jessica had bet everything on this dark alliance with Henry, and now it was all crumbling. As she passed Margaret, Jessica cast one last look, a mix of disdain and defeat. "You think you've won?" Jessica murmured, her voice low but bitter. "But there's no victory in all this. What's left for you? A broken daughter? A ruined life? In the end, Margaret, no one wins." Those words pierced Margaret in a way she hadn't expected. For a moment, the weight of those words hit her deeply. Sarah was alive, yes, but in what state? She would survive the poisoning, but what about the trauma and the invisible scars that would never fade? The joy that should come with victory was momentarily replaced by a bitter sting of uncertainty. Margaret watched as they took Jessica away, her mind echoing with questions she didn't know how to answer. What would happen next? How would Sarah recover from all this? As the police finished the process and the ambulance medics took care of Sarah, Margaret stayed by her side, feeling incredibly small in the face of the enormity of everything that had happened. The cold of the night was penetrating, but she barely felt it. Her hands were intertwined with Sarah's, feeling the lightness of her daughter's skin, the almost ethereal softness that filled her with deep sadness. With every weak breath Sarah took, Margaret felt a piece of herself breaking. Charles stood beside them, his gaze fixed on Sarah, but his thoughts clearly distant. He had been a rock for Margaret through all the chaos, but now, as he looked at Sarah's frail body, his eyes carried a weight that Margaret still didn't fully understand. "Charles," Margaret began, her voice low, "thank you for everything. I don't know what I would have done without you." Charles shook his head, his somber eyes meeting Margaret's again. "I would do anything for Sarah, Mrs. Margaret. Anything." His voice broke slightly, and for the first time, Margaret realized the depth of Charles's feelings for her daughter. The silence between them spoke more than any words. Margaret looked at Sarah, and suddenly, a sense of guilt began to creep inside her. If she had come sooner, if she had noticed what was happening earlier, maybe Sarah wouldn't be on the brink of death now. Maybe things could have been different. Reality was cruel. What Jessica had said had a grain of truth. No one emerged unscathed from this tragedy. There would always be a weight, an invisible mark on Sarah's heart, on hers, and even on Charles's. When the stretcher was brought inside the ambulance, Margaret felt her body tremble. She was exhausted, but she couldn't allow herself to collapse just yet. There was a long and arduous road ahead. She watched as the medics adjusted Sarah on the stretcher, connecting her to devices to stabilize her. The ambulance lights reflected on her daughter's sleeping face, and all Margaret felt was a mix of relief and fear. Relief because Sarah was still there. Fear because she didn't know if it would be enough. The ambulance door closed softly, and Margaret climbed inside beside her daughter. The journey to the hospital would be the first step of a long journey. She held Sarah's hand the entire ride, feeling every small movement, every breath. The tears she had been holding back since the beginning finally fell, and the silent sobbing brought with it intense pain, a pain only a mother could feel. "I promise you, Sarah," Margaret whispered, her voice choked with tears. "I won't let you face this alone. I'll be here always. Always." Margaret knew that moment marked the end of one battle, but the war for Sarah's recovery was just beginning. When they arrived at the hospital, Margaret watched as Sarah was taken inside, the hospital doors closing like the beginning of a new chapter, or perhaps a new kind of fight. Sitting in the waiting room, alone, Margaret finally felt the weight of it all. The scars that remained in Sarah would be deep, but Margaret promised herself she would do everything to help her daughter find her way back to life, to find herself again. Now, with Henry and Jessica in custody, the physical danger was gone, but the emotional one that would continue to haunt them for a long time. Margaret closed her eyes, letting the tears flow freely. She didn't know what the future would hold, but she knew the unconditional love she felt for Sarah would be her strength. Because, in the end, it was all she had. If you enjoyed this gripping story and want to follow more captivating narratives like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Leave your like and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming content. Your participation is so important and helps us keep bringing more incredible stories for you.